You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 23rd of January 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Donald Trump does not mince words in Davos. Can Europeans respond with a positive nationalism of their own? And is Pope Francis really the right person to be talking about AI? I'm Chris Turmack. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Turmack. My guests today, John Everard and Alex von Tunzelmann, will discuss today's big stories. We'll get an update from Davos and speak to Monocle's Fernando Augusto Pacheco about the Oscar nominations, hot off the presses earlier today. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily and I'm Chris Turmack. I'm joined today by John Everard, former British ambassador to Belarus, Uruguay and North Korea, and by Alex von Tunzelmann, historian, author and screenwriter. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello there.
I guess as an opening question, we will be discussing a fair amount of Trump inevitably on this show as we have been this week. But what have you both been up to other than what did you do on Inauguration Day? Did you actually watch or did you do something completely different, Alex?
I did something completely different. It's rather interesting. We were talking about this, about how actually the viewing figures, which of course Trump cares about deeply, were very much down, even on Biden's inauguration for Trump too. Which is rather fascinating. And I think a lot of people like me I had to work. Fairly straightforwardly, couldn't really take the afternoon to watch it. But I sort of in the past might have looked in out of a bit of interest, but actually I sort of felt, I sort of can't face it. And I knew that whatever happened, I would be shown afterwards on news clips. And indeed, there was Elon Musk doing his controversial hand gesture. Suddenly saw that sort of 100 times, from the next morning already. So I sort of felt that I could really skip it, which rather stole poor old Trump's thunder, really, didn't it?
John, what were you up to on Monday?
I watched it. I kind of felt that this was an historic moment that I wanted to live through live. And, it was not an entirely comfortable experience, but I sat through it, and I sat through the inauguration speech, which was scary. One thing that really struck me was not what Trump said, most of which were predictable. It's the way he said it, pausing pointedly after every remark, clearly expecting adulation from the crowd. And when the camera panned the crowd, you could see that people were watching each other to make sure that they didn't stand up in the wrong place, but most important, that they were not the last person to stand up for the standing ovation. I'm so old, I remember Joe Stalin. It was the same then. If you were in Stalin's presence and you were the last to clap, heaven help you. I had a sort of sinking, chilling feeling watching the whole thing go in front of me.
Well, speaking of reactions, we're going to get some reactions from a different sort of room because U.S. President Donald Trump is fresh off of a wave of executive orders since his inauguration on Monday, but had to explain himself to the world's global elite at the World Economic Forum in Davos today. Trump addressed Davos remotely, laying out his administration's policies. And Monocle's senior correspondent, Carlotta Rebello, is joining us live from Davos. Carlotta, you were in the room where Donald Trump did not mince words, would be one understatement. What stood out to you?
Yes, I don't think he did much explaining to those in the room, but more stating. And I was in the room, next to the room, because it was absolutely packed, Chris. Even though we knew it was going to be a virtual address, despite some rumors yesterday that he or someone from his delegation might try to make his way. Eagle-eyed watchers following flight radar saw that Air Force One had not left Washington, D.C., so it was going to stay virtual. And despite that, as soon as it was possible for people to queue to get into the plenary room, the room immediately got full. And then there's the overflow room, and that one got full as well. I was outside the third space trying to find if could get my way in. And the reaction as he was speaking, everyone in this room was glued to their phones, listening in. Some of the moments in the speech led to some unanimous laughter in the room, and you could see that people were kind of despairing a bit. And when it ended, the mood had completely shifted. As soon as Trump finished his address, so before it went to the Q&A, John Kerry walked out of the room. He was trying to be discreet and left through one of the back doors, but exactly because of this overflow, it was where a lot of us of the press were. So he did not stay for the Q&A and was not happy what he had heard. A few, just to give you snippets of what I was hearing in the Congress Center afterwards, European CEO was giving an interview saying how he was slightly shocked at what he had heard, despite not all of it being new. He was still shocked that was the tone that was taken. Another person was talking about the threat of, or I should say, the invite to come and, make in the US or not, and then face the consequences. And he was talking about how most Korean companies have no objections to manufacturing in the US. So whatever the president says, and I'm quoting, Korean companies are ready to work with DC. Another voice on the ground saying this was essentially declaring war on Europe, that he was not making friends and was making that very clear from week one of his second term. And also another person saying, when it comes to the actual message itself, much of this we've heard before, but was it essentially a threat against the oil-producing nations? So I think that gives you a bit of a picture of the mood right here in Davos at the moment.
It absolutely does, Carlotta. I mean, there's so many different aspects of this that we could ask you about. The manufacturing one was certainly interesting. Trump saying if you don't make your products in America, then you will have to pay a tariff. It might be your prerogative, but nonetheless, you will pay a tariff. Largest manufacturing. He focused on AI as well with this $500 billion investment. He wanted to make America an AI and crypto hub. And I did want to ask you a bit about that. I'm just curious if that is something that is being discussed maybe more positively at Davos?
I can say that after the session, no one was commenting on that. I think everything else overshadowed so much of what he said. I'm sure that, once the dust has settled, because AI and the intelligent age is indeed a theme of this year's annual meeting here at WEF, I'm sure that will become perhaps one of, let's say, the silver linings in what we heard this afternoon. But in the immediate reaction in the Congress Center and then spilling out into the promenade, there was no mention of that. I must say, Chris, I didn't make Donald Trump to be a sort of urbanist. There was a lot of references about big cities, big buildings, the Los Angeles Olympics, and I don't know what to make of it with my urbanist cap on and what he's trying to allude there, but it was a bit odd.
Carlotta Rebello in Davos. Thank you very much for joining us. You'll hear more from the team on The Briefing and Globalist tomorrow. But let's bring in our panel for now back here in London. John, Trump does not stand on diplomatic niceties. Let's put it that way. When he addresses a forum like Davos, he takes these countries and business leaders, for that matter, head on.
Yes, he does. But that's always been the case, hasn't it? I mean, that is part of his style that's been a constant right through his political career. And it's perhaps no bad thing. I mean, to be told directly where the President of the United States stands at least leaves you no doubt as to what is going on. I mean, I was listening with great interest there to what Carlotta said. The war on Europe, I mean, we've already had clear statements from the European Commission that, firstly, don't forget that we are bigger than you. You try to trade sanction us, and we trade sanction you, and we bring large parts of the US economy to a halt. They didn't quite put in those words, but that was the message. Notice also the much deeper nervousness in Moscow and Beijing than in Brussels. Putin and Xi having had that obviously rather anxious conversation. Putin carefully calling Xi a dear friend, Xi pointedly not reciprocating. They're trying to shore up some kind of relationship in the face of what they probably quite rightly regard as an imminent American assault on their positions. I mean, there's no doubt that we are entering a very different world, a world in which Trump is quite prepared to rip up rule books and go for transactional rather than value-laden relationships. And I think that shone through, if shone is the right word, in his speech.
Alex, one of the questions I have, I suppose, is even when, as John says there, none of this is necessarily surprising in terms of the transactional approach of Trump, the way he speaks about it. is something perhaps different in the way that the world is reacting to it? Are other countries' leaders more ready for it this time around?
Well, I mean, I think there's a sort of complicated yes and no answer to that question. I mean, I think Trump at the moment he's riding a complete high. You know, he's just got back in. I mean, actually by quite a narrow margin, we now know, but he obviously thinks this is overwhelming. He's issued all these executive orders, obviously all ready to go. Out they've come. You know, he's kind of, at the moment, he feels clearly like this sort of unstoppable force. He's come out with this really extraordinary speech today, which was a proper kind of manifestation of, obviously just thinks he's king of the world. You know, you're going to have to lower oil prices, partly because he needs more energy to fund AI. I mean, this is actually rather a big issue. And, you know, I mean, Carlotta said it might be a silver lining. Well, maybe, but also environmentally, there's real concerns around what that means. Then at the same time, you know, well, then I'll lower interest rates. Then you should all follow us in doing that. You know, really just sort of issuing instructions around the world. And I mean, you know, look, we've seen this guy before, and I don't think anyone was unprepared for that sort of style. But the specifics of what he is focusing on, you know, the kind of the take, I think, is complicated and interesting. And it does seem from reports that, you know, there were some pretty bad feelings in the room among Europeans about this and sort of how we respond to this and what, you know, what might be done next after that and, you know, how to handle this situation. So I think, you know, in some ways, yes, it's the same sort of style, but I do think it's been rather turbocharged right now.
Well, let's move on to one other aspect, I suppose, of Trump's first days in office, and that is the war in Ukraine, because there may have been some worry before the inauguration that Trump was going to do a deal with Vladimir Putin, but the last few days Trump has been perhaps surprisingly critical of the Russian president, calling the war ridiculous, making clear also in his Davos comments that the war should never have been started, and warning of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions if Russia does not agree to end the war swiftly. Alex, Donald Trump vowed to end the war immediately. This is what he said already in the campaign. He does seem to be placing the onus at this point for doing that on Vladimir Putin. Is he already growing impatient?
Well, it does sound like it, doesn't it? And this is another interesting thing, I think, sort of coming off my previous comment about the idea that actually he's riding high. At the moment, Trump is feeling, I think, like he can do anything. And, you know, that we'll all just have to do what he says. And I find this very interesting because John's absolutely right to say also that Putin is clearly quite nervous, actually, and sort of, you know, cozying up to Xi. And this is kind of, you know, something, there's a very complicated realignment going on. And I think Putin has often felt in the past like Trump is somebody that he can understand and steer, perhaps. I mean, control would be too strong a word, but shall we say steer? In the previous, you know, they felt that there was a certain amount of sympathy between the two of them, actually, that they understood each other. And I think, you know, you saw Putin almost having this attitude, like I think he sort of thought he had the measure of him and all of that. This is probably quite different. So, I mean, I would love to know what is going on in the Kremlin today and how they are talking about this and responding to this. I think it's fascinating, and I don't know. I wish I did.
John, can you give us some insights on that? What do we imagine is going on in the Kremlin right now? Because exactly as Alex points out, we might have imagined before this that Putin felt he had the measure of Donald Trump. But it does seem almost like with some of this that perhaps Trump did not get the answers he wanted from Putin ahead of his inauguration, and now he's changing his tone a bit.
Yes, what's going on in the Kremlin? Deep concern. I suspect that a lot of people are biting their nails. This all started, remember, with Putin's conversation with Trump before the inauguration last month, which clearly went so badly for the Russians that Putin tried to pretend the conversation never took place, which is a sort of slightly difficult thing to pretend, but there. Calling a war ridiculous is not the kind of thing you say to a deeply respected fellow authoritarian. Trump has clearly done 180 degrees on this. People on his team are saying that there are two big issues here. Firstly, he wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He's thrown his toys out of the pram because Obama's got one and he hasn't, and he wants one. Scream, scream. Two, he no longer thinks that Putin is such a genius. I think Syria has changed his mind a lot. I mean, Putin clearly holed up there. And three, he is desperately, that's third out of two notice, he's desperately worried that Ukraine should not become his Afghanistan. He saw what Afghanistan, the withdrawal there, the messy withdrawal, did for Biden's reputation. He does not want the same in Ukraine. He has to win in Ukraine. So he has to force Putin into negotiations and into concessions concessions. That is going to be extremely difficult. Putin has got his right wing screaming in his ear, we take Ukraine. Without Ukraine, Russia is no longer an empire, as Brzezinski once said. We have to take over this place, and if you give up, then you're not worthy of being a leader. Putin will not make concessions. Trump will find that sanctions are not going to work on Russia, and the next thing is going to be watching the Russian economy crumble as Trump successfully brings the oil price down. Remember that Russian production costs of oil and gas, come to that, are only slightly below current market prices. If the market price goes much lower, then Russia is no longer a viable oil exporter, and the Russian economy implodes. Watch this space.
Alex, listening to all of that, the one thing it makes me wonder about, I suppose, also putting on your historical hat, have we ever had a comparison like this of a U.S. and a Russian leader? If we imagine these two meeting at some point, the contrasts between these two at the moment in terms of their approaches, their motivations, it really could go frankly either way, right? At this point, we could be seeing World War III, or we could see both of them somehow back down and Putin leaving Ukraine.
Yeah, both of them riding shirtless on horses into the sunset. Who knows? Of course, we've had extraordinary meetings in the past between American presidents and Russian leaders. I think immediately probably one of the most extraordinary, the Berlin summit between Kennedy and Khrushchev, which in the early 60s, which was an absolute disaster. And Kennedy was furious about afterwards because he felt that Khrushchev had just completely beaten him up, and had really who had a very sort of rollicking style at the best of times. And, Kennedy was utterly unprepared for it, and it was really a pretty significant disaster. So, certainly, look, bad relations, difficulties of communication have certainly happened in the past. I think what's perhaps different now, and John just sort of laid out the roller coaster for us, is actually how interconnected this global economy is and how much all of that can sort of directly have effects. It's very different from the Cold War. This is a very different world shape that's going on. So I do think, it's not that the sort of, perhaps there's sort of some recognisable themes, but let's say this is a very, very different world that we're working in now. And I think it's extremely interesting to see what will happen with things like the energy prices and all of this, which now have, such colossal potential effects. And who knows what would happen with a sort of completely broken down Russia would be a completely different situation.
The Kennedy-Khrushchev meeting is an interesting one, and I do wonder, John, if there are almost parallels there too, that perhaps Donald Trump realized, as you suggested, that in his first term he was perhaps taken advantage of by Vladimir Putin, but this time around things will be different.
This time around things will be different. A very different President Trump. President Trump, of course, knowing that he's got no future. He cannot stand again. He's an elderly man. This is it. He's in cricket terms, he's running a catch. Are we going to see a replay of the previous summit? Russian radio yesterday said that somebody close to Trump, one of his team, was saying that Trump and Putin will talk on the telephone in the next few days and will meet in the next few weeks. Now, I don't know how well grounded that is, but it does have the ring of truth about it. And I suspect that, before we spend too much energy speculating, we're about to find out how this goes for real.
John, one other thing I wanted to quickly ask you about before we move on is the role of North Korea in all of this, because this is, of course, your specialty as well. And what's interesting, Trump, I should also say, he's been laying out sort of the casualties. Was also quite surprising in his Davos speech, saying, really, you have no idea what the casualties are. They're far worse on both sides than anyone imagines. And North Korea is the same. There have been some new figures out about just how many North Korean troops have already died in this.
Absolutely. The full North Korean deployment to Russia, remember they're in Russia rather than Ukraine, seems to have been about 12,000 men. Of course, there's no published figure. And unnamed Western officials have been telling various media outlets that they think 1,000 of them have died already, been killed. The total casualty figure must be at least 3,000, probably nearer 4. So something like a third of the 12 have already been knocked out. This is it's a human disaster, of course it is. We're starting to see North Korean surrender. The first two, of course, advertised by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians won't advertise it anymore because they've realized that if you tell Pyongyang who it is you capture, Pyongyang goes after the families, and you have got a big deterrent for more surrenders. Whereas if you just keep it quiet, then Pyongyang doesn't know whether people who've gone missing are dead or have been captured. There's a huge headache here for Pyongyang. I mean, 1,000 dead, strangely, is not their real problem. A senior North Korean general told journalists a week ago that they would simply be cremated, the ashes would be sent back, the families never get to see the body. They'll be careful about that, and the whole thing is brushed under the carpet, so to speak. Their problem isn't that, it's the wounded. What do you do with 10,000 wounded men? You cannot hospitalise them in Russia. There aren't the facilities. If you take them back to North Korea, you can't hide them. There will be contact with their families. These men are angry. They've been cheated. They were told they're going to Russia on training. And Kim Jong-un is going to face a tremendous political backlash. Again, watch this space.
Well, let's move on somewhat, because Donald Trump's revival of America First rhetoric and action since his inauguration will have been expected, as we've been talking about, but perhaps one difference this time around is how much other nations have been willing to work within those confines, maybe even rally around their own national identity. NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte has been among those readily accepting that Europe needs to pay for its own defense, and many citizens abroad seem unfazed by the nationalism that Trump espouses, perhaps because an increasing number of their own world leaders espouse the same sort of rhetoric. Alex, is there such a thing as a positive nationalism? Could we see that in Europe? Could we see that elsewhere, sort of rallying around national identity?
Well, here we are in an infinite universe. I mean, it could be anything. Historically, the record of nationalism is generally not great. Although, it does vary a lot. And also we do use that word to mean two quite distinct concepts anyway. One of which is a sort of independence and freedom from a greater empire, and one of which is a sort of bullish, sort of often quite jingoistic movement that is very insular. And those have quite different identities, although they can overlap. But effectively, I mean, I think what has come off this, surely, and it sounds like the people in Davos might well be feeling quite a lot of this too. This is a real test for Europe and for other nations around the world who don't have much choice but to interact with the US. Actually, I think for some of the Middle East too, and all sorts of places. I mean, does this straighten the spine? And in what sense does it straighten the spine? Do these countries sort of accept, sort of try to work around the US, or do they come up with their own response and their own? And, I do think there's an element of nationalism, self-reliance, that probably is called upon actually here, because do these international links suddenly become very problematic? I think there's a range of responses possible, and I think what I would probably hope is that this is a point when actually Europe somewhat bucks up and realises the need for a sort of more cooperation and, perhaps more sort of looking at its own record and getting its act together, rather. But I think there's also a range of much more damaging responses that are possible. And, once again, sorry to keep going back to we'll see, but it is rather a we'll see question. I mean, Europe at the moment doesn't... I did see one line where I think it was a CEO at Davos saying that, Europe's reached peak pessimism. Well, I hope it's the peak, because sometimes, the darkest hours before dawn and all that, and perhaps that is what is needed for a sort of reality check. Or perhaps it's just incredibly depressing and going to get worse.
John, to that point, perhaps Mark Rutte is one of those people, as NATO Secretary General, who's trying to sort of pull Europe out of that pessimism that Alex was just describing there, saying there are things we need to do ourselves. We do need to up the defense spending. Europe should pay for its own defense. It should even pay for American weapons, as Rutte suggested, in order to back Ukraine. Is that kind of thing even possible? Do we see Europe maybe rallying around? Because defense is, at the end of the day, the biggest sort of expression of a national identity you can have.
I think it's entirely possible that, yes, we will. Mark Rutte is not stupid. He would not have said what he did without at least some kind of conversation with other leaders who are not going to rush out and confirm in public to their electorates that, yes, they're going to start paying for American weapons. Certainly not in France. Nationalism, I think what we're watching is huge. We're talking just now about Trump. I think Trump is just the most immediate manifestation of a ghost that's stalking the world. It's not that the international institutions that we so carefully constructed after the catastrophe of the Second World War are collapsing. It's that we are pulling the plug. We are walking away from these institutions, not just the United Nations, but the Bretton Woods institutions, the various European institutions. And we are going back to a diplomatic world similar to that of the 1890s, where states simply act in their own interest and form posses, as George Bush would have said, to pursue joint interests when these occur. And where violence, Pacheco Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, becomes okay again. I mean, Trump is openly talking about conquest, not necessarily by violence of Greenland and retaking the Panama Canal, Canada, but acquiring land in a way that, he might as a real estate mogul. And I don't think Trump is alone. We've come full circle, and it's very hard to get a grip on why we've done this, how this came about. But the mood change is palpable and it's extremely powerful.
Alex, just one final thing on this. I mean, when I was in Washington for the inauguration, one of the people I heard was Argentina's president, Javier Milei. He was at the inauguration. He called for this sort of international right-wing alliance. And it did make me wonder, how do nationalists cooperate? What does multilateralism, as John was alluding to, multilateralism is not in a good place right now. But what does multilateralism look like in a world of nationalists?
Complicated. I think the sort of posses that John described are perhaps a more realistic kind of manifestation of it, that there may be shared interests. But I think one of the things, that even looking at the sort of right-wing nationalists that are on the stage now, and, whether you look at it within the US or in the international arena, one wonders how all these big egos cooperate and stay together, or whether at some point there are combustions. And certainly, I think, it's one thing for several right-wing nationalists, as we've seen, and for instance, the European Parliament or anything, to bond together when they feel that they have a shared opponent. I think quite another thing if they're all in charge to bond together without, because, that sort of, very fundamentally, that kind of right-wing nationalism absolutely requires an opponent, an elite that they are raging against somehow. And now, global elite, which they might talk about in Davos that we mentioned, might be who they feel they're raging against. But if those people aren't in charge, and they are, then there's a bit of an issue for them. And that possibly is the point that is the big test of their own sort of philosophy and indeed their sort of shared interests.
Well, finally, for our panel today, another of the many world leaders who addressed Davos this week was Pope Francis, and the focus of his speech was the threat of artificial intelligence and the ethics around it. Now, to be clear, there are serious issues to be addressed here, and this is something of a focus for Pope Francis for a number of years now. But I also couldn't help thinking there was something slightly comical in the leader of one of the world's oldest institutions in the Catholic Church addressing something as futuristic as artificial intelligence. And as this is our final item for the daily, I wanted to turn this more on that aspect of the Pope's address. So, John, I'm asking you because you are absolutely not the oldest person in this room. Should there be an age limit on discussing futuristic technologies?
Wow. No. Firstly, thanks. That's the nicest thing you said to me all evening, Chris. No, I don't think there should be. I mean, this is, the future of older people like me, just as it is of you. Okay, our future may be slightly shorter. Nevertheless, what we have, we cling on to. And do remember, I mean, the Catholic Church, of course, a very ancient institution. The Catholic Church deals in eternity. I mean, from the Catholic Church's point of view, this is just a drop in the ocean. Can I say, too, that I thought actually a lot of what the Pope said about AI was extremely thoughtful and intelligent. I mean, look, full disclosure, I am not a Catholic, but I always read encyclicals, and I find that the Pope actually has a take on world affairs that is almost always worth listening to, and this was no exception. I mean, he wasn't trying to set out answers, but he was inviting a global debate about what we're doing with this amazing new power that we're developing. Is this a blessing? Is this a threat? We do need to think about it. Yes, amen.
He definitely did go into the ethics in an impressive fashion. I will absolutely give him that. It was not, perhaps, Alex, like the U.S. senators trying to talk about TikTok talk with their CEO
Oh,
few
bless
months
them.
back.
Yes, very sweet. So on the toctic, what is the thing that happens with... Yes, I know. I mean, quite embarrassing. And I mean, that whole parade of events has been rather disastrous, I think, for everybody. But no, I mean, actually, I have to say I rather agreed with John. And, the Pope, of course, has been an early victim of AI, and that a picture of him went viral in a big white puffer jacket that he had certainly not worn, of him looking really rather street smart. But I thought, actually, the funny thing is, the sort of things he was raising, these ethical questions, are things that I hear from friends in tech who often say to me that we are not talking enough about, we're letting this kind of horse has galloped miles out of the stable. We're not talking about regulation. We're not talking about how we use it, what it might do. We're not having these ethical conversations because governments at the moment, I mean, the British government being an example, is falling over each other. So, yeah, great, tech will save us. It's the answer to everything, without actually thinking, well, hold on a minute. What's happening here? We need to talk about it a bit. And yes, obviously there's loads of potential for it, but also there are quite significant dangers and social changes this could bring about, and we really need to think it through. And actually, this is something I'm finding my friends in tech are generally very cautious about, and I think a lot of them will have appreciated the Pope's speech today as actually echoing quite a lot of their concerns. So far from putting a limit on him commenting on it, as I say, funnily enough, he's the person articulating something that actually is, I think, quite future connected. And perhaps that is the sort of having the marvels of eternity behind and in front of you is actually being able to step out of this kind of government view that is so sort of over-enthusiastic and often perhaps rather under-informed, and actually sort of think about this on a more ethical level.
Well, there we go. I tried to debase this, and we're all positive on the Pope and AI. Alex von Tunzelmann and John Everard, thank you very much for joining us today. This is the Monocle Daily. And finally, on today's show, the 2025 Oscar nominations were released earlier today, and who better to tell us about them than Monocle's senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco, who joins me right here in studio. Fernando, good to have you here.
Good to be here as well after this amazing list of nominations today.
And we will get to this amazing list, but we did want to start with why they've only come out today. There was a delay because of the LA fires. What did the Oscars say about that?
Well, of course, and Chris, this year's ceremony, I think, they will have to talk about the fires, because most people in the industry, and I believe even some of the actors, some of the big names that we might see at the ceremony have been deeply affected. So it's unavoidable. And even today, during the nomination, the program they had, that was the first thing they said. So I think we'll be hearing a lot about the fires in this year's ceremony, and I think that's fair enough.
That is fair enough, so we will hear a focus on that. But let's move on to the nominations. And Faye, I'm going to start with not the big ones, because let's be frank, I was upstairs with you, and I know that there's only one you really cared about. So tell us about that.
Well, I was jumping up and down. I'm still here, of course, the amazing Brazilian film directed by Walter Salles. Picked up the nomination for Best Foreign Film. That was expected. But also for Fernanda Torres for Best Actress. She's the second Brazilian to be nominated. The first one was her mother, for a film also directed by Walter Salles. So that's amazing. And for Best Picture. And you know what, Chris? This reflects on how the Oscars are becoming international, because even the most nominated film of them all, Emilia Paris, with 13 nominations, it's a French production. The language of the film is Spanish. Do you know what I mean? So it's becoming very normal to have international auteurs, nominated for Best Director, for example. I think that's a very positive thing about the Oscars.
It is a positive, and it is a change, isn't it? The fact that so many foreign language films as well are being nominated. Tell me a little more about Emilia Perez, which did get the record 13 nominations, as you mentioned there, obviously also going for Best Picture. What's your sense of this film? It's gone kind of back and forth over the last few months or so, but nonetheless, as you say, the fact that it's also an international showing is pretty significant.
It's very significant, and it's not just the fact that it's international, but the fact that it's a bit of an odd film. It's a musical about a trans character, mobster from Mexico. It's very difficult to define. It was directed by Jacques Audiard. Of course, the film has people, you either love it or hate it. Funnily enough, I'm in the middle for this film. But nevertheless, I think it's a brave film. I think it's very original. I think the Academy is loving the film. There's been a little bit of a backlash. I think some people in Mexico don't think the film portrays the country in a very nice manner, among other things. But, I would say that it's one of the favorites to win for Best Picture.
You were saying earlier as well, and perhaps Emilia Perez fits into this, that you feel like the Academy is taking risks in a way that maybe it hasn't before. Tell us about that.
And one film that defines that as well, not just Emilia Perez, but The Substance, directed by Coralie Fargé, also from France. It's a good year for French directors. 2 of them are nominated in the Best Directing. I don't know if you've seen it, Chris, but it's a gory film. It's the music is loud.
I don't really go for the gory films.
Oh, it's super gory. It's funny. It's a satire, but also at the same time quite feminist. And Demi Moore, I think, is one of her best performances ever. She's been, of course, nominated for Best Actress. The Oscars would never nominate a film like this in the past. But this time, it has 5 solid nominations in the big ones. Picture, directing, actress. So I'm very happy with the Academy. There's some years that I come here and say, wow, they're a bit boring. Kind of, we all knew which film was going to win. But this year is a little bit unpredictable, and that's a very good thing.
Well, and I don't know if this is predictable or not, but just to ask about the 2 films that maybe have the second most nominations, also kind of interesting mix. The Brutalist on the one hand and then Wicked on the other. I mean, that does show that there's quite a breadth this year of styles that are being nominated in the Oscars.
Which is also great. And of course, we know that the Academy loves musicals. But it's been a while since 2 proper musicals have been nominated in the Best Picture. We have here, of course, Emilia Perez, Wicked, with 10 nominations, which is a lot. And maybe, I'm not sure if I can define it as a musical, but a complete unknown as well. Had a great showing, which is Bob Dylan's biopic. Who knows, Timothée Chalamet could get his first Oscar.
Just finally, Faye, any other surprises for you this year?
There's one, I wouldn't call it a surprise, but I thought the Oscars were quite brave. Sebastian Stan for Best Actor for The Apprentice, where he plays Donald Trump, the current president in the US. I mean, I was genuinely thinking that the Academy was not nominating him, maybe to avoid controversy. But no, they were brave enough. And you know what? Fair enough. He is very good in that film. I would recommend. It hasn't been a success in the US. I think in Europe it did better. But who knows, after the Oscar nominations, people can start watching it again.
And I'm sure they'll be watching his speech if he does end up winning the Oscars later on. Faye, thank you very much for joining us. Fernando, Augusto, Pacheco, our senior correspondent. That's all the time we have for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to my panelists today, John Everard and Alex von Tunzelmann. Today's show was produced by Anita Riotta, researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Chris Termack here in London. The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.